Grief is a strange thing. It doesn't come in waves like people say. It crashes and drowns you all at once, then lingers in the quiet corners of your soul. When my little boy passed, the world stopped turning. The laughter in my house fell silent. His favorite toys sat untouched, and I was left clutching memories that felt too small to hold the weight of my love for him. His funeral was the hardest day of my life. A day I thought my family would stand with me in my pain. But my parents never came. They sent excuses instead. "It's too hard," they said. "We'll remember him in our own way." I tried to understand. But how do you forgive the absence of those who should have held you up when your knees gave out? As I stood by his tiny casket, surrounded by friends and strangers who came to honor him, I felt the hollow absence of my own parents louder than the hymns that played. Weeks later, when the rawness of grief still tore at me, they called. I thought maybe it was an apology, a moment of reconciliation. Instead, my mother's voice came sharp and unapologetic. "About the trust fund. Your son doesn't need it anymore. Your sister's wedding could really use that money. It would mean so much to her." I nearly dropped the phone. The trust, $850,000 saved and secured for his future, was sacred. It was his. It was the last piece of him I could protect. My parents spoke of it as though it were an abandoned gift card, something they could redirect toward flowers, catering, and a ballroom full of laughter. They had skipped my child's funeral, but they wanted his future to bankroll a party. For a moment, the old me, the daughter desperate for approval, wanted to shrink, to question if maybe they were right. But then something inside me shifted. My grief turned into steel. My voice steadied. "No," I said firmly. "That money was for my son. It will remain in his name, honoring him. If you care more about appearances than family, then you've already chosen what matters to you." There was silence on the other end. My father muttered something about selfishness, but I didn't flinch. For the first time in my life, I realized I didn't need their approval to stand tall. I hung up, and I cried. Not because I was weak, but because I was stronger than I had ever been. In the months that followed, I found new purpose. I set up scholarships in my son's name. I supported causes he would have loved. I built something that turned my grief into light, so that even though his small life ended too soon, his legacy would ripple outward. And here's what I've learned. Family isn't defined by who shares your blood, but by who shows up when your soul is shattered. My parents chose absence. My parents chose greed. But I chose love. I chose to honor my son. If you've ever been abandoned in your darkest hour, hear me when I say this. You are not alone, and you are not powerless. You carry within you the strength to rewrite the story, to turn pain into power, and to honor your own truth even when others betray it. Stand firm, protect what matters, and never let anyone tell you your love, your grief, or your worth is something they can take. Grief is a strange thing. It doesn't come in neat stages or follow a schedule. It ambushes you, heavy and unrelenting, like a storm that refuses to pass. When my little boy died, the world lost its color. The days blurred together in shades of gray, and even the sunlight that managed to creep through my curtains felt cruel, as if mocking the darkness inside me. I walked through the house like a ghost, tracing my fingers over his toys, his clothes, his drawings taped crookedly to the fridge. Every corner of my home carried his laughter, his tiny footsteps, his voice calling, "Mommy," until suddenly it didn't. The funeral was the hardest day of my life, harder even than the moment I held his still body in my arms. I remember standing by his small casket, clutching a flower so tightly that the stem snapped in my hand. The chapel was filled with people who loved him in their own ways, friends, neighbors, even some of his little classmates who held balloons they could barely grip. Their presence meant something. Each hug and tear a small reminder that my son mattered. But the faces I longed to see most weren't there. My parents' seats stayed empty, two stark reminders of the love and support I desperately needed but didn't get. Every time I glanced toward that row, a fresh wave of hurt washed over me. They should have been there, holding me up when I felt I couldn't stand. Instead, their absence pressed on my chest like a weight, and I couldn't help but wonder how people who claimed to love me could choose not to show up on the day I needed them most. When the service ended, I stood at the graveside watching as the earth swallowed the last piece of my little boy. My knees buckled, and someone I barely knew caught me before I hit the ground. I clung to strangers, because my own blood hadn't come. That pain burned deeper than words can ever capture. It was betrayal layered on top of loss, abandonment stitched into grief. And though I tried to understand, tried to tell myself that maybe it was too hard for them, a part of me knew the truth. They simply didn't see my son's life as worth honoring the way I did. They sent excuses instead, flimsy words that rattled in my ear like coins tossed into an empty jar. "It's too hard," they said. "We'll remember him in our own way." My mother's voice was cool, as though she were explaining why she couldn't make it to a dinner party rather than her own grandson's funeral. My father didn't even call himself. He had her deliver the message for him. I sat there on the edge of my bed, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the wall as the words sank in. My hands trembled, and I kept waiting for her to soften, to say she was sorry, to admit that of course they would be there, that they just needed time to process, but she didn't. She ended the call with a clipped, "Take care of yourself," and hung up. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe grief made them shut down. Maybe it was too painful for them to face the truth of a child's coffin. But as I stood in the chapel days later, glancing at those empty seats, the excuses curdled inside me. Grief wasn't supposed to keep family apart. It was supposed to bind us closer, to remind us that love carried us through storms. Their absence wasn't about pain. It was about choice. They chose not to come. Every hymn that played felt like a reminder of what was missing. As I clutched the program with my son's smiling face on the cover, I kept thinking how surreal it was that people I had known for only a few years showed up for me. Yet my parents, who had known me my whole life, who had held their grandson in their arms, couldn't walk through those chapel doors. That betrayal hurt in a way that was different from grief. Grief hollowed me out. Betrayal burned. It left me standing in front of everyone, trying to be strong, while inside I was crumbling from the knowledge that the people who should have carried me through this were nowhere to be found. Weeks later, when the rawness of grief still tore at me and I was barely learning how to breathe again, the phone rang. For a second, I thought maybe, finally, it was the apology I'd been aching to hear. Maybe my parents had realized the depth of what they had done, how their absence had cut me as deeply as the loss itself. I answered with a shaky hope in my voice, bracing for the words I'd longed for. "We're sorry. We should have been there. But that isn't what I got." My mother's voice came through the line, sharp, almost businesslike. She didn't ask how I was holding up, didn't mention my son, didn't even pause to acknowledge the silence that still haunted my home. Instead, she went straight to it. "About the trust fund. Your son doesn't need it anymore. Your sister's wedding could really use that money. It would mean so much to her." I froze. For a moment, I wasn't sure I'd heard correctly. I asked her to repeat it, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely catch my breath. She sighed impatiently, as though I was the one being unreasonable. $850,000, she said, pronouncing each syllable as if she were reading from a ledger. "Think of how perfect the wedding could be. Think of the photographs, the memories. Why let it sit unused? Unused." That was the word that shattered me. To her, my son's future, his education, his dreams, his life that had been stolen from him, was nothing more than unused money. She spoke as though his existence had been erased, as though the only thing left of him could be repurposed into champagne toasts and floral arches. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles whitened. My throat ached, my lips trembled, but beneath the grief, something darker and steadier began to rise. Rage, yes, but also clarity. In that moment, I realized the depth of their selfishness. They hadn't come to say goodbye to him, hadn't stood with me when the earth closed over his casket, but now they wanted what he had left behind. For a moment, the old me, the daughter who had always bent under the weight of their expectations, almost slipped back into silence. I had spent my life shrinking when they spoke, swallowing my protests just to keep the fragile peace. A familiar voice in my head whispered, "Don't make this worse. Don't argue. Just let it go." But then another voice rose, steadier, louder, fueled by the image of my son's smile, by the sound of his little laugh echoing in my memory. He deserved better. His name, his memory, his future. They weren't bargaining chips for a party, and I wasn't going to let anyone treat them that way. I straightened where I sat, my hand trembling, but my words firm. "No," I said, the word cutting through the phone like a blade. There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that tells you someone isn't used to being told no. I could almost hear my mother's jaw tighten before she hissed, "You're being selfish. Your sister deserves this. She's alive. She's building a future. Don't waste that money on sentiment." Her words made my stomach twist, but they didn't weaken me. If anything, they solidified the steel in my spine. My father chimed in then, his voice low but laced with irritation. "You're clinging to money that serves no purpose anymore. Be reasonable." I closed my eyes, letting their voices wash over me, and then I found my center. "That money was my son's," I said, each word deliberate, my voice calm even as my heart raced. "It is the last piece of him I can protect. It will remain in his name, honoring him. And if you can't understand that, then maybe you've already shown me exactly what family means to you." The silence that followed wasn't just silence. It was shock, disbelief, maybe even anger that I had dared to stand up to them. But for the first time in my life, I didn't flinch. I didn't back down. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear and realized something I had never fully believed before. I didn't need their approval to be whole. There was silence on the other end of the line, a heavy silence that seemed to stretch for miles. My father muttered something under his breath about me being cold-hearted and ungrateful, but his words rolled off me in a way they never had before. My mother's breathing was sharp, angry, as though she couldn't believe I'd dared to say no. For so long I had been the quiet one, the pliable one, the daughter who kept the peace. But this time I wasn't bending. I wasn't breaking. I was standing, even if my legs shook beneath me. As the seconds dragged on, I realized I didn't care if they understood. I didn't care if they hated me for it. Protecting my son's legacy mattered more than protecting their feelings. The money wasn't just numbers in a bank. It was a promise I had made to him. A symbol of the life he should have had, the dreams he never got to chase. To give it away would be to erase him, and I refused to let anyone, not even my own parents, take that from me. When I hung up, my hands were trembling, but not from fear, from release. I cried, but they were different tears than the ones I'd shed at his funeral. These tears came from strength, from reclaiming something I didn't even realize I had lost, my own voice. For years I had let their approval define my worth. That day, I learned that my worth was never theirs to measure. In the months that followed, I found clarity. I poured the trust into something that mattered, creating scholarships in my son's name, funding programs for children who reminded me of him, bright-eyed, full of promise, with futures still ahead of them. Every time I saw a child benefit from his trust, I felt him close, as if he were telling me, "Good job, Mom." And slowly, I began to understand that while my parents had chosen absence, I had chosen love. They had chosen greed, but I had chosen legacy. And in that choice, I finally discovered a strength that no betrayal could take away.